Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm joined by co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
Hey, Jamie, I'm very good. Actually, I had a good experience just the other day. For the first time, somebody recognized my voice in an academic meeting, and they're like, "Hey, I know your voice." And he's like, "You're on a podcast." I was like, "Yes, yes, somebody recognized my voice." Yeah, so very good. Thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, these are the victories.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Dr. Christine Kupfer. Now, Christine's background is in medical anthropology and education, as well as being an expert in Rabindranath Tagore's philosophy. As far as today is concerned, she has spent some significant time researching what we're going to call the dark side of meditation. Christine, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks for having me today.
So there's so much to get into around spiritual crises, what happens when meditation goes wrong. But just to set some context, what is the general perception of meditation at the moment in the West when it comes to being a positive experience, a negative experience, or something in the middle?
Yeah, so overall, I would say it's still very much seen as a bit of a panacea. That's something that people can do for just about anything. If we're looking at headlines in and of blogs, of news articles, and so on, there's an endless amount of things that mindfulness could be applied to, starting from just general well-being and stress, but also like more kind of mental health aspects like depression and anxiety, of course, but then also going into any other topics, be it just confidence, or does it fertility. There's articles on performance at your job, productivity. It's just gone, become really, really big and touched kind of every area of life, it feels like. So definitely perceived as something positive, something, why don't we just all meditate? Why don't we all kind of invest into this? And rather than kind of seeing it as something that in some situations might be really, really helpful, but maybe there are also some contexts, or for some people it might not always be the best thing at that very moment.
Why has it had that effect? Why are we not more balanced in our perception?
Well, a lot has to do with, I would say, like something have to do with the research. So the people who do research in this area are usually people who are invested in it in the first place, like people who are kind of, who don't really care about these things. They might not necessarily go into that. And we had an explosion of research in the last kind of decade or decades, couple of decades maybe. That of course fed into clinical applications. It's been growing a lot in how it is, which institutions want to use it. It has been publicized by important companies, big companies that have been using it, starting with Google and others. Of course, it is also something that sells. It's something that speaks to a trend that we have here at this current time of like look after yourself, kind of feeding into, maybe even to take it into a bit more political perspective, into ideas of neoliberalism, of where we are thinking, like what do we do with our lives? We need to perfect our lives. We need to kind of be good citizens, be good people, and maybe mindfulness can be of help in that way.
Interesting. And to what degree do you think, and this is a projection perhaps, that whenever West meets East, we tend, to the degree that meditation is East, we tend to a little bit put it on a pedestal and perhaps don't engage our critical facilities to the degree that we might if it was a Western invention. Does that strike you as at all contributing?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I mean, the way that Buddhist philosophy has been perceived in the West is, of course, on not just perceived, but also that it's been promoted, has been like a taking away of certain areas, that's like decontextualizing it in many ways, like just the mindfulness, looking at the mindfulness techniques, but also in general, like, how, is Buddhism a religion or is it a philosophy? Can anybody do it? If we did the same thing, say, with Christianity or with Islam, and because they have meditation techniques, of course, as well, that they've been using. If we work with that similarly, I think there would be a lot more critical perceptions around it. Absolutely.
Because
I would also say, though, that it's not just a one-way kind of street. I mean, that's something that easily gets forgotten as well. It's not just that we took mindfulness from the East and it's just went like that. For example, the meditation techniques in Burma or Myanmar, Vipassana meditation that might be quite well known in the West. Is not just that Westerners went there and kind of got these ideas and transported them over to the West. It's something that developed because at the time that the Westerners arrived there, it wasn't done amongst lay practitioners. It was actually something that was neglected in many ways as well, and it was the interest of the West then that made it big, developed it, that people became in Burma became interested and thought, let's revive that. So it's complex processes, really.
I love that perspective. And I imagine one of the things that's been left behind when we decontextualize some of these mindfulness practices is some of the problems you can run into, because I know that's definitely part of the cultural context, right? I mean, it's not uncommon to hear in an Eastern meditative tradition warnings about, you got to make sure you don't practice like this, or if these sorts of things, these are the kinds of signs that maybe you're practicing in the wrong way, or this is the kind of uncomfortable territory you're more or less likely to go through if you're going to go deep in here. And then this is the kind of medicine and remedy as well. So I know this has been a big interest of yours as well. So I'd love to hear anything you have to say here about just this context of where things can go wrong.
Yeah, so in terms of kind of like if we're looking at the Buddhist context, for example, things that were practiced before people were even introduced to mindfulness were around virtue and ethics was a major area to learn how to live a good life, how to respect life, but also not just in terms of for the world around oneself, but it also has an effect on oneself, on one's own stability. Like ethics are important for that, and we don't need to go to Buddhist cultures to and I know you're both coming from philosophical backgrounds. I mean, ethics is such an important part in building up character and that which can be really helpful and to also prevent some difficulties in meditation that can come up. On the other hand, something that can get neglected is sometimes the focus in the West is very much on the mind, on awareness and attention training, and aspects of compassion get kind of forgotten about, or around wisdom and what comes with that.
And you've had quite a bit of experience looking into some of the challenges that people here in the West have had in the meditation community. Anything there stand out that you'd like to chat about? I mean, because I know you're interested in spiritual crisis, and this is one of the things you've been engaged with. What sort of is that spiritual crisis, and how's it related to meditation?
Well, spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency are kind of two terms for describing when people touch on non-shared reality. They have experiences of non-shared reality. That could be one maybe definite. It's very hard to define it, but there are many different ways of describing it. We can also think of it in different categories. So, for example, some people use different kind of frameworks to express what they're going through. So it could be around experiencing somatic energies and talking about Kundalini awakenings. It could be around a dark night of the soul. It could be around seeing things that other people might not see, or hearing things that other people might not hear. It could go into dissociation, but also DPDR, depersonalization, derealization, lots of different areas that, so this would be a psychiatric term, of course. For them, it would be a different experience around experiences around the self, loss of self, and so on. But it can also be more positive ones. It could be unitive experiences that then, that might be, at some point be experienced as something really beautiful, but then still tip people over the edge, and they find it hard to deal with them.
What so some of those phrases you just used, dark night of the soul, dissociative, what are those, and why does meditation on occasion produce them?
Well, sometimes people, so like maybe we need to also differentiate like because we talked a little bit about mindfulness, and we talk about meditation, and more generally I would say with mindfulness it's kind of encountering spiritual crises. There's no statistics on that, but that seems rather rare, and it's more intense meditation retreats or in more intense practices and different sort of methods that are used. For example, intense breathing techniques that are part of meditation, or working with energy in the body. These things can be really intense and sometimes also taken out of context without the necessary preparation before that. And particularly in these situations, when that happens, when people are kind of tapping into these sort of more unusual and intense breathing and techniques, for example, they just can get out of touch with reality. They could get overwhelmed by what is going on for them. Another thing that can happen either mindfulness, meditation, or other forms, is like trauma can come up, which can then deregulate a person. So many different kind of aspects that can be going wrong or can be difficult.
And like, are there certain approaches to meditation that make that more or less likely?
Just as I said before, there are some approaches which are particularly those that are usually only taught in traditions after quite some time and quite a lot of preparation. Then some of them are more like the kind of maybe left-handed, those that attempt to get results quicker. So left-handed and right-handed. The right-handed are kind of the ones where, like in Indian or Eastern philosophies, that are safer, that are kind of going with all the virtues, like respecting all of that. These are kind of thought to be slower, but also safer. And then any of the more extreme ones, like it could be around the breathing, energy, but also around different thoughts that and ideas that people work with. These can be more intense and more problematic. And on the other hand, intensity really matters. Of how long people practice seems to have an effect. Being on a retreat. And again, what exactly are the factors is not entirely clear. It's also like people are away from their home context. They are usually they might drink coffee and smoke cigarettes or what have you. That is all taken away. They usually have phone. They have eye contact. This is taken away. There's a lot of questions on like which exact factors are leading to those difficulties that some people experience.
It's interesting. It sounds like those difficulties, though, feel distinct from the difficulties you might have through doing a non-spiritual activity like meditation. And I just want to capture that difference for myself and for listeners. That if I go on a cycling retreat, I'm unlikely to experience a dark night of the soul. Now, I might be unlikely to experience it during meditation, but there's something about the mechanics of being on the breath or something that can produce those experiences. Do you have any sense, is there any sense in the research of what it is that makes meditation different to cycling?
Well, I don't know anything like in regards of cycling producing that. However, people who are marching, like who are walking for really long times, they have also encountered spiritual crises before. So it's not necessarily just that. So where those moments when you think you're for this long time in silence, in you're centering in, concentrating inwards, or so there's a change happening. Lots of things can produce or can lead to those some difficulties. It's not just meditation. However, of course, the more intense practices that I've been talking about, the breath and working with energies, which is then of course a proper spiritual practice rather than just a mindfulness kind of technique. It's really intense. It really it it can really deregulate people in those moments. But if we're kind of thinking cycling or marching and walking, the breath is involved in that as well, isn't it? It's like this. It's going faster or slower, and if I don't know if any research has been done about awareness of the breath in those moments and how that would affect the experience, but that would be interesting.
It's very interesting because it implies that it sounds obvious when I say it, but it's a feature of the experience, whatever that feature might be. Something that's shared with marching, be it silence, rather than the activity inherently itself. What do you recommend that people do when pursuing meditation or anything that induces a spiritual crisis?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get to too. I mean, first of all, how can we buckle in to gain a little bit more safety? I think that's very interesting. And if we have a spiritual crisis, what have you found in your experiences here can help? Or, I mean, what do we do when we run into this problem? So how do we protect ourselves, and what do we do if we fall?
Yeah, so one thing I think that's really important is knowing that meditation can take us into these places, right? Just having an awareness around it and not assuming that it is necessarily good for in all situations for everybody, and then can be really helpful. So, for example, if people practice and have difficulties of some sort, quite in the beginning or later on, and a lot of advice they get is just to keep sitting with it, like whatever it is, just to keep sitting. And sometimes it's actually better to step back, because as soon as there is for not quite spiritual crisis, but just some difficulty, like something that could happen, somebody is depressed and they are practicing mindfulness meditation, and they're not haven't quite learned to decenter really well. That kind of flexibility isn't there. And instead of meditation helping them, they kind of actually go deeper into that, this vicious cycle of negative thoughts, because they're holding on to it. So in those moments of, going into this negative place will just drag them deeper, because the practice isn't working properly. So rather than just sit with it in that moment, it might be better to just do something else. And if we're looking at Buddhist advice on this, if people have, there are conceptualizations of those difficulties in Buddhist teachings, and the advice is very often don't meditate, eat grounding food, do something totally different, even eat meat, or have sex, or things that are usually discouraged, and going the other direction. So that is something that's helpful in terms of trauma. And difficulties that are relating to that with meditation, because of course when we sit, stuff can come up. Trauma sensitive mindfulness has become quite a big, or definitely a bit of a bigger thing recently. So trauma awareness, when mindfulness and meditation is being taught, is of huge importance. So kind of knowing that there is a high likelihood that if a teacher has a group of meditators, that there will be somebody with trauma experience. It's just very likely. And to know, okay, so for example, don't use breath as an anchor, because that might be uncomfortable. Maybe you want to use sound instead. Or, just being flexible, giving people choices so that they feel in control of, like, maybe you want to keep your eyes open rather than closed, because that might make you, take you into a different zone, a different space that is hard to deal with. So these are kind of like maybe things that can help to prevent entering into deeper difficulties. And in terms of what helps, the other question you asked, what people have found most helpful is grounding, anything grounding. So quite similar to what I just said around the Buddhist teachings as well. Actually, many find it really helps to take themselves away from busyness on the other, and find a place of silence and contemplation. But this is quite interesting, because the grounding that can be, it can be the silent. Taking oneself away and just and focusing on just being in nature, or just sitting without meditating. But it is also important for example, to be in touch with other people. Sometimes that's something that gets neglected in spiritual crisis.
Wow. One thing that I'm hearing, and I hear this quite a lot, is it seems to me part of the issue for people practicing well, and part of the issue for people finding their way out if they've had a little bit of a slip, is to actually have somebody wise in their life in an ongoing, in touch way that can help them sort of check in with what were the right conditions to be in, when should you step away, and helping them navigate whether it is more silence or more busyness they need. And you're not getting any of that in the modern sort of course structure where people are popping in and doing high level practices for a short period of time with teachers they barely know, who charge big bucks and then don't stay in touch with them afterwards. So they're just coming in, dipping in, doing high level practices, and then having no support structure afterwards. I think this is a little bit crazy style, actually, because then you don't have anybody saying to you, oh, wow, it's a bit wobbly. Okay, I know you. So let's talk. Is that helping? And no, it's not helping. Okay, try this. Is that helping? Right on. Now that's helping. That's where you want to stay. And like, check in with me tomorrow and let me know how it's going. We really do need that, don't we?
Absolutely. No, that's such a good point, Mark, because having in today's time when so much is done via apps or via just courses that are impersonal or computerized. So many mindfulness courses are just prescribed from healthcare providers and just like that. And having a community, having a good teacher at hand who can guide them when there are difficulties would be so helpful. Absolutely.
It's interesting too, because you mentioned that the traditions account for some of these difficulties, and will say, prescribe different things, be it eating meat or having sex. To what degree are these difficulties built into the path with some of these traditions? To what degree are they expected and necessary parts of the process as viewed by the traditions?
Yeah, so some of those difficulties will be expected in if we're looking at pathways of the different jhanas, for example. There is a phase where it's even taken as a sign of progression in some traditions. Of we need like this time of darkness, and is something that will need to happen before people move on into other and kind of into a more stable sort of practice. Absolutely. But there's also areas where it's kind of about having taken the wrong path. It's like, kind of gotten away from what really matters. And that it brings us back to kind of the idea of decontextualizing. So for example, if we don't, and not having a teacher maybe who will guide us. So like some of the people I've spoken with in my that I interviewed, where they were kind of misunderstanding some, I would say, some of the philosophical contexts and applying them in a way of, kind of mixing up levels of absolute reality with a relative one that we have to live in, having maybe not like mistaken view of the self, like deconstructing the self, but then kind of getting lost in that and not quite knowing where they are in this world anymore. Boundaries that completely dissolve. So having a teacher around for that, and to bring them back and into some understanding, or having a community to discuss things with, is absolutely helpful.
That's interesting, because as you mentioned, meditation can deal in some high-end concepts, the self, the ego, etc. And in some way, it's no surprise that people who attack it with intensity but without the right lifestyle context might get a little bit lost. To what degree do you think the teachers that say, or the traditions that say, you need to run into difficulties, to what degree is that true? Or to what degree are those... Because if it is true, those difficulties need to be interpreted totally differently than if it's not true.
I just want to say something quick there. I mean, that's really tricky, isn't it? That we have problems, or we have challenging experiences, and they can either be signs on the way, or they can be warnings you've gone the wrong way. And what a tenuous thing to decide for yourself, especially if you're on your own. You're starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable. Uncomfortability is natural, but it also could be a sign that you have wrong view, or that you're thinking about the practice in the wrong way, or you're approaching it in the wrong way. Like you have a really like a personality type approach to meditation where you're like, now I'm going to practice 5 hours a day, and you have no structure for that. I mean, that's tough, isn't it? Because they could be some similar experiences. One saying great, the other one saying watch out.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a really tricky one. And I think, yeah, having some, for that very reason, to have teachers, to have a community, rather than getting lost in those very complicated, abstract sort of concepts and, going down some kind of rabbit hole and getting lost in that is very important.
Is there anything from your experience? I mean, I know there's no magic bullet here, but what would you be giving as advice to somebody you were speaking with who was running into a little bit choppy waters to sort of discern whether these are beneficial waters or sort of unbeneficial waters? Maybe context is king here, and it would have to be the person in the moment, like their personality and how they're practicing altogether gives you that information. But is there anything sort of context invariant you look out for, I wonder?
It would be I would really say that comes down to the individual and the context.
Exactly.
So I'm kind of thinking, but I would say if somebody is kind of like a huge warning bell for me would be there if somebody has lost touch to, normal everyday life, which is a sign of a spiritual crisis, of stopping to care about anybody in their life, all people that used to matter, constantly being either hyper aroused or hypo aroused, and or having like any of those things that they will probably be concerned about themselves in some way as well. It's not something that you need to necessarily see from the outside, but this would all be very kind of worrying, and in terms of bringing them back, thinking of again this kind of grounding everyday things, to connecting with other people, eating good food, being in one's body rather than just in the head and floating into higher spaces. Very helpful there.
The question that comes to mind then is, should there be some kind of a guidebook? Is there things that teachers particularly need to watch out for as they're teaching this material to help their students not run into these kinds of pitfalls?
Yeah, that would be really. I think some things that should definitely be there are around trauma, and this has been developed, and it's kind of. There are some ground rules to pick up on, which I kind of already talked to around using, being flexible around the different anchors, and speaking with people about alternatives, and making people aware that this can happen. Another kind of way to help people that I've encountered in some traditions, some Buddhist traditions, is also not to make too much out of experiences that are kind of beyond the ordinary. So if somebody has kind of sees the lights and thinks they have reached a higher level, to realize this might just be an experience, and to be with it like with anything else, and let it go, rather than hook onto it and start clinging and striving to have exactly that same experience, or to start inflating their ego in some way of thinking, oh, I'm so, I'm having those experiences and I'm already at this point. This can be quite helpful to kind of normalize it and say, yeah, these things happen, but they will pass again, and that's okay. And so rather than people trying to get more of it constantly.
Go. The peak experiences are nice, but they're not really the markers of progress, are they? I mean, what you'd look at rather than that is, are you becoming more compassionate, more empathic? Are you a better community member? Are you able to support more people? Are the people around you getting better? Like those are the real markers, aren't they? Peak experiences come and go. Lots of weird stuff happens on the meditative path, but I always look to see, am I a better human being overall, as the real marker of success. And we have lots of these little, stories, and lots of the spiritual traditions that warn against this, taking experiences too seriously. I love the one from Jewish mysticism, where they talk about somebody on their way to God's house, And the closer you get to God's house, the more beautiful the landscape becomes. And the few areas, even before the castle, are filled with diamonds and gold and jewels. But if you step off the path to pick up the jewel and put it in your pocket, then you become too heavy to keep going on your journey. So you have to just leave these special little things that happen if you really want to go the distance. You have to go light. You have to have no pockets, as they say, in order to get in. And I like that. Again, you're being told this sort of folk wisdom that don't pick up things on the way. Just keep the goal in mind. Keep going. It's just another thing that passes.
Yeah, such a helpful and apt story. And yeah, really beautiful.
So, when modern psychiatry and psychology run into these kinds of problems, how do they tend to respond?
You mean when they encounter people with spiritual crisis? Well, yeah. So this is pathologized a lot, particularly if it's a psychosis-like experience that people are going through. So it's really, really tricky. Because lots of experiencers will experience, or for them it will they need somebody to support them. Meditators might tell them, well, just continue practicing or something, or and that's not helpful. Psychiatrists will come in and they will try to shut down the process in some ways, right? It's something that is not. That's not normal and therefore not right, and therefore there's medication and people might get sectioned if they're showing these signs of psychosis and so on. And for a lot of people who interpret their own experiences as spiritual crisis, this is an extremely hurtful and traumatic process because they're not heard in the ways they're conceptualizing what is going on for them. They feel that they're being, the process is shut down, and they cannot continue with what they've started with, which they often might interpret as, yes, I'm going through something dark, I'm going through this darkness, but there is light at the end of it. I just have to work through it because there are difficulties in my life that need to be addressed, and. But don't have any other safe space to be in. So creating safe spaces for people experiencing this would be an absolute priority, and allowing that their language to have a space rather than calling it all psychosis. For them it is something different.
Yeah, it's interesting because meditate more isn't helpful, but nor is shutting down the process if you're invested in seeing the process through. And I think a lot of the people that you're describing want to see the process through, believe in the wider mission, but they're incredibly uncomfortable. And I can see that in traditional psychiatry and perhaps traditional meditation circles, depending on who your teacher is, right, and how well you know them, you might end up getting the two extremes that feels unsatisfying. Where can people in the midst of that go?
There are different organizations, like in the UK, the Spiritual Crisis Network, or in other places, Spiritual Emergency. Just kind of finding the organizations that are there and contacting them, because it's different in every country, so it's hard to list them all. But there are some kind of safe spaces, like different kind of therapeutic centers, but these are very rare. In terms of working with experiences like that in a non-pathologizing way, or in ways that don't medicate people straight away, but that kind of are open to that. I mean, there have been different movements around, say, open dialogue, or even in history, kind of Lang, the experiments that he did with kind of having houses for people where they can. With schizophrenia in that case, or with psychosis experiences, and opening them up, being there for people, looking after them. But there's hardly anything available these days. So it's definitely an area that needs to be worked on.
And has anything surprised you in your interviews with people going through spiritual crises?
I love that question.
Yeah.
It's a kind of wide open question. I love to hear, because especially with experts, I mean, what have you found that's been surprising?
I think one thing that I found with religious meditators, also particularly with Christian, like I tried to kind of have interview people from different backgrounds, particularly Christian backgrounds. There was I spoke with quite a few going through what they call the dark side, a dark night of the soul, and who were highly, where their world had turned black. They were close to suicide, huge depression, and what was the thing that was most helpful to them was a form of believing. It was a form of submitting themselves to the like letting go and trusting. That was something that wasn't, that I don't think is quite there in the literature yet. It was this moment of, yes, there's absolute darkness, but I am trusting this process. I found that really interesting.
Wow, faith, and that's something that we haven't taken over with the cultural context, is it? We don't talk very much about faith and devotion, which were necessary ingredients in a lot of these contemplative training vehicles. Hard for, I think, Western people sometimes to swallow that pill and find a way to have faith or to have devotion. But look, it turns out to be a kind of special ingredient when you run into turbulence, to be able to say, I really trust this path, or I feel like I'm being guided, or I know I'm in good hands. Because if you can do that, then you could let go of the resistance. And if you let go of the resistance, then the thing will tend to find its own natural ground. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. That focus there on the letting go of the resistance, I think that's an absolute key for people who have been in real crisis.
Mark, you mentioned type A personalities earlier. And Christine, I'm interested, just anecdotally, are there any consistencies in the types of personalities that run into spiritual crises?
Yeah, so that's not in my own research, because I don't have the numbers, but in some other research, there have been this kind of tendencies of groups of people, and one of them was kind of young men who are striving and quite perfectionist and just practice. I'm committed now. This is what I do. That was one of those groups, and there was another group that seemed to be at risk, maybe at higher risk. I don't know. It is anecdotally. I don't think it's like the real numbers are in yet, but was around women, kind of midlife crisis times. That seemed to be another kind of group at risk. But of course, probably even more at risk is anybody with a background in who has kind of mental health problems, who has kind of instabilities regarding personality, who hasn't really established their own boundaries, of the difficulties with their own concept of self, for example, can be really hard. Suicidal thoughts, and having a tendency to be either very anxious or getting depressed. All these things can get in the way, and it's like, if any of those, particularly around the mental health issues, if anything like that is there, I would particularly, I think it's important to have somebody along one side who can give them some advice on where is that am I on the right path here? I'm having these difficulties. Is it okay to just proceed, or are those big warning bells that maybe I should take it easy and not and take a break?
Christine, where can everybody find you online?
I've got a website, christinekupfer.org.
Brilliant. Well, Christine, it's so interesting to talk to someone who's had the kinds of conversations and then the kind of research that you have had, because spiritual crises are something I think can feel quite lonely when you're in them because of the lack of, huge historical literature, etc. So a huge thank you for coming on, and a huge thank you for what you do. And I hope the listeners have enjoyed that half as much as I have.
Thanks so much for having me today. It was great talking to you.
This has been the Contemplative Science Podcast, and thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.